I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how the Western Mysteries was introduced to you and what what place it played in your practice.
For me, I think I need to start a little farther back though with the idea that awakening is a universal teaching, and so there's nobody's got ownership on the awakening principle, right? Every method out there, Buddhist, Christian, whatever, shamanistic, is climbing up the mountain from a different slope, different angle. So as you're going up the mountain, the views look way different. The methodology is different. Everything seems different. But when you get to the top of the mountain, insofar as you get to the top of the mountain, then the view is the same fundamentally. However, different methods are more facile or more usable or more or easier to use for me than others. And so the two methods that I really use mostly are Buddhist because their map and their route up the mountain is so incredibly clear and straightforward. And the Western Mysteries, which is it's a bit more rocky, I suppose. There's a few trees and stumps you got to go around, but equally effective, and you get a view from that side that you don't get going up the Buddhist side. You can extend that to the other traditions. Shamanistic is closer to Buddhism and to the Western mysteries than it is to religion. So in a way, Buddhism has an exoteric and an esoteric teaching that it's very clear about. The Christianity has an exoteric and esoteric tradition as well, and the exoteric tradition is the church, whichever church you happen to belong to. But the esoteric tradition is the Western mysteries, and typically that's been kind of shunned or scorned or considered weird. And its partner over on Islam is Islam and Sufism. So Islam is the orthodox exterior kind of path, and then Sufism is the mystical inner path. So the Western mysteries is the mystical or esoteric side of the Christian tradition coming out of, as we know, Judaism and Mithraism and Zoroastrianism. So that's kind of a context for it.
When you were incorporating Western Mysteries practices into your path, were those things that Rinpoche brought to you and suggested, or did he allow your energy to guide and then meet you with the practices when you showed up in a particular way?
Yeah. I think that the thing you need to recognize about the Namgyal tradition, which is my teacher was Namgyal Rinpoche, is it's an eclectic teaching. It's the first teaching into a new country, and it's always brings the teaching into new territory. So, for instance, when the Namgyal lineage went into Bhutan, they brought Buddhism with them. There wasn't Buddhism in Bhutan. The Namgyal lineage brought it in. So, similarly, Namgyal came to the West, was born in the West, right? And he brought it into North America along with Trungpa. But Trungpa brought it in pretty much exclusively, although he, of course, over time, he became much more eclectic. But he kind of adapted to the Western culture. But it came as a kind of it as a Tibetan Buddhist monk initially, anyway. Namgyal came in as a white Westerner, right? He had a Western degree. He had been in music school. He had been in the Communist Party and out of it. He was a writer and a musician, and so he had a very eclectic background. And he taught that way. He taught science. He taught Dharma from science, from the arts, uh, across the spectrum. Trungpa did too eventually. Um, and so there was no clear definition or clear separation between the two principles. When he would give a talk, he might be talking about Taro in one breath, and then the star, which is what Tara means, and curiously enough, is the star. He might be talking about the star card in the Kabbalah and the tarot in the next sentence. So there was always the shifting ground between Western and Eastern points of reference, different metaphors from both the East, from China, and then from Europe. So it was always eclectic. So there was no place where you could hang your hat and say, "Oh, okay, we're doing." I mean, he would do strict, Buddhist teachings like the meditation on the Satipatthana, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, and he might do a whole course on karma, womb, transcendence, which is really Western in its scope, right? But there, if you read the book, there's all sorts of references to Buddhism in the East. So it was depending on what course he did or what retreat he did, right? Yeah, the retreats were mostly Buddhist because that's the Buddhist tradition, is meditative. But the courses, when he did a course and it wasn't just sitting meditation, then it got way more Western, more more Western approach. He had people do papers on subjects, pick a subject and do a paper on it. Somebody did a paper on Socrates, for instance. So mixed bag, as you say.
Yeah, and it sounds like the eclecticism really appealed to you as a student. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I'm born in the West, right? I'm a Westerner. That's my culture. My parents come from Europe, and not second generation, but my parents come from the Western tradition. So these are images you grew up with as a kid. You know, you grew up with an idea of a magician when you were 5. You were introduced to the concept of a hermit, especially if you lived in a big city or someplace, and you'd see somebody in robes, or a Catholic priest or something. You were, this was around you when you were learning to talk. So these metaphors are more immediate, they're more visceral for you because that's where you're born, that's where you're raised in. Now, if you get into previous lifetimes, et cetera, the game gets much bigger and much broader, but at least in this one. So Namgyal used to say, well, the Eastern tradition, the Eastern initiation, say in the Vajrayana school of deity practice, are quite easy for us to get. I mean, a Tibetan in 100 years ago would have to walk for maybe a month to a temple or to a town to get an initiation, and she might only get 1 or 2 in their lifetime. And we roll in as Westerners and we get like 10 a week or something. And it's like they're quite more easily available to us than they were to the Tibetans pre 20th century anyway. But the Western tradition, the initiations are much more closely held. For instance, the outer teaching is quite accessible. You can get a book on the tarot anywhere. You can get a book on the Rosicrucian anywhere. You know, it's any bookstore will have a broad spectrum of such things. But to get the actual initiation process, which is usually done with a master in a lodge, that's a different ballgame. Now in the West, the Western lodges are mostly exoteric. They've become men's clubs or service organizations. They don't do the inner lodge work anymore. There are exceptions, but hard to find, and they're not going to advertise. So I was very fortunate to be able to do the movement of the tarot, if you want to call it that, or movement of the mandala, the actual embodiment exercises, engagements with my teacher and 29, 30 other people, the first thing I did with them. So that was great.
When we speak about the Western mysteries, what body of work are we actually talking about then?
Whether you're East or West, the teaching is done through metaphor, paradox, and parable. And the minute you try to make it literal, you kind of burn the pizza. You might still be able to eat it, but it's not the same meal. So, for instance, if you wanted to do a marriage in the sense of wedding the understandings, I really recommend you read a book called The Cave and the Light by a guy named Arthur Herman. It's The Cave and the Light, Plato versus Aristotle and the struggle for the soul of Western civilization. That will give you the entire outer history of the West in terms of philosophy and psychology, not so much psychology, but understanding how we got to be who we are here. And then if you can join that with the tarot or the Kabbalah or the Western mystery exercises, then you have the two sides, kind of Plato and Aristotle in a way. And then, but what they don't have in the West so much is a clear understanding of the lack of a permanent self, no inherent self, and emptiness. So then you go over to the East and you get the archetypes, which does what the tarot does, right? And you have the Buddhist teaching, which is philosophically the kind of balancer to Western philosophy. But Western philosophy is never really questions the idea of an inherent self and an understanding of emptiness or spaciousness, which separates the two traditions distinctly. So if you put those things together, you have a full, well-rounded kind of history of humanity, both materially and spiritually, which is why I do it. The Western work is as effective for a practitioner as the East is, but the practice for the Westerner is harder to wrap yourself around because the practice isn't, the practice isn't really super defined. You got to sort of do it yourself. And as we know, when we go back to work from our spiritual course, we tend to get into habit and just go back to. So if you went to work and you decided, okay, today I'm the magician, and you went through your workday trying to understand and inculcate the principles that you've learned about the magician and how it works and its function and its relationship to the other 21 major arcana, then they could be an effective practice. But there's nothing to bite your teeth into. Whereas if you go to work and you do Chenrezig mantras, Om Mani Padme Hum, compassion, you can kind of run that kind of as a background, right, through most of your day without much effort. A little harder to apply the magician in your day. Doable.
Mm-hmm. And so, and then in terms of that, if when I think of the tarot, most of what I see out there is about using it as a divination tool, and I'm aware that that is not what I mean. One of the things that when I talk to people about why I'm so drawn to this lineage is that it is always about how to integrate and to transform, and nothing is superficial. And I was wondering about if who would be kind of a good fit for somebody who might have some exposure to things like the tarot.
Well, again, I mean, as whether you're East or West, what determines your progress on the path of awakening is your motivation and your aspiration. So let's take an example of astrology. 90% of people that do use astrology to basically map their personality, their strengths and their weaknesses, and whether they get along with this guy or this woman, and so on. Right? It's all about me and my life and how it affects me and how I can use it to affect myself or others and so on. So me, and more me. And then you have Astrodharma. Now, Astrodharma is astrology applied to a transpersonal, to the awakening principle. So now astrology doesn't become a personal tool per se. It becomes a way of using the astrological principles to understand the nature of patterning of the psyche. It moves it to the transpersonal. And so same too in the East. You have all sorts of people in India or in the Himalayas churning out mantras endlessly without any idea what they're doing. They're just it's kind of just rote. So it's not the tool, it's the person using it. So same thing with tarot. You can use tarot for divination, and insofar as you have a decent reader of the cards, that can be useful at a practical relative world kind of level. But you know that's the same thing with the I Ching, right? You throw the tarot Yarrow stocks and read the I Ching for the same reason. You can use it as a personal divination or direction tool, right? Or you can study the I Ching as a book of changes. You can study the I Ching as an understanding of the cosmos. What's your motivation? What's your aspiration? And what kind of eyes are you using to look at it? Is it about transcendence or is it about the ego and the personality? And so you get both.
And if somebody was interested in exploring these traditions, the Western Mysteries traditions, what would be a good starting point for someone?
Well, I'd start reading. That would be number one. Um, and I'd start studying. That's reading. And then I would find somebody who knows something about it and has some experience with it. And you start from there and then follow your nose. Um, if your interest is superficial and thin, then your contact with who you find and who might help and be of service will probably be thin. And if you have a deeper, stronger interest, then you'll find a deeper, stronger connection to somebody or something that it does it more deeply. So again, it comes back to the same answer, really. Your path is determined by your aspiration and your motivation as a starting point, but it's completed by your will. So how strongly determined are you actually to do the work? And it is work, whether you do the Western mysteries or you do the Buddhist path or Christian path or Hindu path or shaman path, it's work because the ego is a creature of habit and wants to stay comfortable. And it's that very nature of staying comfortable and habit that keeps people asleep. Nothing wrong with your habits, but it doesn't wake you up. And the whole point of spiritual teachings is to wake you up. I can't remember who said the dreamer must awake. And Socrates, I think, said the unexamined life isn't worth living, right? So, it starts with Socrates in a way in the West, right? Like if you're not examining the nature of consciousness, that's metaphor for your life, then what are you doing? Watching the hockey game? I like hockey games, but I'm not going to watch them all the time. I got other stuff to do.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you shedding some more light on this topic.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for
Thanks.
having me, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
May all beings be well and happy.